Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Christian Democracy, where we talk about Catholic social teaching in the light of contemporary affairs. My name is Jack Quirk. We begin by praying, Father, let us be the hands that bring food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, healing to the sick, comfort to the prisoners, and welcome to the strangers. May everything that is said here be in furtherance of these. And St. Joseph the Worker, pray for. My guest tonight is John Medaille. He is a retired businessman in Irving, Texas, and he is also an instructor in theology at the University of Dallas, where he teaches a unique course on the social encyclicals for business students. He is the father of 5, he is the grandfather of 3, and he wants to inform us the husband of 1. He's the author of The Vocation of Business, Social Justice in the Marketplace, and also one that has gained some currency toward a truly free market, which is largely about distributivism and how distributors can understand the economy and engage in dialogue with others. He writes for the Front Porch Republic. He used to edit and blog at the Distributist Review, and he even once did an article for Christian Democracy without too much damage to his reputation, and I would like to welcome him. John, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you.
Jack, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, and we are pleased to have you here. You know, I as I told you before the show started, I went and I reviewed my copy of your Toward a Truly Free Market, which I have to say is is an electronic form, which I can get it. I have it on Kindle basically, but it's always there. I never lose it that way. We move around a lot. It's never packed in a box. It's just always there for my perusal. And it's about distributism, and you are one of the primary voices, contemporary voices about distributism. And it's a word that I use a lot anymore because I've come to somewhat understand what it means, but sometimes it seems like I don't, because some people say, well, that's not distributism. And so perhaps you could enlighten us as to what distributism is versus socialism versus capitalism versus Buchananism, any other isms that might be out there. If somebody is a distributist, what do you expect that person to believe?
Well, I think the primary belief of distributism is, as Chesterton put it, if property is good, it's good for everybody. And as many people should have property, and by property here we're talking about productive property that can be used to support a family and a person.
What the Marxists would call the means of production.
Exactly. Or also, of course, the means of a house, the means of living. But basically, we're talking not about so much consumer items, but we're talking about property that can be used to support a person. And it is this understanding of widely distributed property that forms the core of distributism. Now you can compare and contrast that with capitalism and communism. Capitalism believes in privatized property, gathered in as few hands as possible. And capitalism naturally tends towards monopoly, cartel, oligarchy. And so that property, the means of production, are in fewer and fewer hands as time goes on. Now, Marx understood that problem with capital and how capital gathers property in the hands of oligarchs and puts production in collective cartels. But he analyzed it in the wrong direction, and having determined that too few people had property, he then determined that henceforth no one should have property. And so the state would own all property in behalf of the people. Well, as Zizek pointed out, Marxism was really just the sort of the ultimate capitalist fantasy, and hence it collapsed. So as opposed to the communist who wants the state to own property and the capitalist who wants the oligarchs to own property, the distributist wants widely distributed property, either in the form of personal property, and I'll come back to the distinction between personal and private property, or property owned with others in the forms of, say, cooperatives. And it does allow room for other kinds of property, even private property or even state property, such as roads, such as the facilities needed to provide the public infrastructure. So it is not dogmatic on property, allows that wide variety of mixes, but the primary goal of the distributist is that each man or each family should have enough property to be able to support itself.
All right. So, in other words, so it really sounds like kind of the opposite of socialism. Socialism, at least classically understood, is that, well, nobody has property. Private property and the means of production or productive property is abolished. And distributism makes it more widespread. Do I grasp that correctly?
I think you do. I would make a distinction, though, between, especially these days, I think, make a distinction between socialism and communism, because socialism is like charity. It covers a multitude of sins. And so there are lots and lots of things that are called socialism. So Norway has socialism and Venezuela has socialism, but they don't have the same socialism. I think when we're talking about gathering all property in the hands of the state, I think we're talking about communism.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to actually kind of point out, and that is that socialism today, and that's why I say classic socialism, or socialism in the day of Leo the 13th was that ended up being what we call communism. What socialism today, it seems to me, means almost nothing. I mean, Bernie Sanders was calling himself a democratic socialist, and all he was, as best as I could see, was a New Deal Democrat. But maybe I'm just not picking up on something.
I think it's a point worth pursuing, though, because what socialism really meant in its original formulation in Proudhon is today what we call anarchic libertarianism, in that there was no state, and without the state there would be no property. Okay, and property would be confined to personal property, just that property that a man could use. But there would be no renters. So if you could farm 100 acres, you could have 100 acres. But you couldn't have 101 acres, okay? Because then you'd have to rent out the last acre or withhold it from use. So you only had property that you could use, and you only had it for as long as you used it. It is not something you could pass on in the family. That was Proudhon's socialism. Now that's the socialism that both Marx and Mises started with. Both Marx and Mises started with Proudhon. Isn't that a kick in the head? But Marx determined that this was romantic socialism, and he wanted it replaced with scientific socialism. So for Proudhon, there is no state, hence there is no property. For Marx, in scientific socialism, well, you first had to have the state that could seize all property, and then administer it in behalf of the proletariat, and then you had the state withering away. So the terms libertarianism, Austrian libertarianism, communism, all which we would consider all to be absolute opposites, in totally different corners of the universe, actually all stem from this same idea. And the central issue is property.
I've never understood the state withering away as long as there is original sin and the ability to apply force. But that's just when somebody sets forth what I would consider to be a kind of naive anarchism. My thought is always that, well, somebody's going to apply force to somebody, and whoever applies force most successfully is going to be the state, whether or not you call it that or not. Whenever somebody gets the ability to compel others to do something that they would not otherwise do, but for that compulsion, you have a state.
Yes, and I think the real romantic was not Proudhon, although he was hardly a realist. The real romantic was Karl Marx.
Right.
And I think he knew it. I don't think even he took the withering away of the state all that seriously.
And yet he had to know, therefore, that depriving every individual in society of private property and the means of production was going to have to require a prodigious amount of force. I don't see how he could fail to have seen that. But of course,
I think he did foresee it. I don't think he considered force that great of a problem. And in fact, force is not a problem. I mean, coercion, okay, although it's the bugbear of the libertarians, I don't see how you so much as run a bowling league without coercion, of some sort. If somebody won't obey the rules, you have to exile them, forbid them from playing in your league. So the question about coercion, in my mind at least, is not, whether you're coerced or not. Life coerces us. Hunger coerces us. Nature coerces us. The question about coercion is whether it's both from legitimate authority for legitimate purposes, that is the common good, and whether it's proportional.
Yeah, but when you end up with labor armies, as Marx proposed in the manifesto, I mean, I can just envision a bunch of people being marched out to work on the farm. It just that strikes me as more coercion than we would be used to. I don't know. In other words, it seems to me a matter of degree. Coercion by itself may not be bad, but a lot of coercion could be very bad indeed.
Yeah, without legitimate authority, legitimate purpose, and proportionality, arbitrarily marching the people from the countryside, as they did say from Phnom Penh, to work on the farms is obviously not a legitimate use of authority. The Gula, of course, all of these romantic things always go terribly, terribly wrong. So you end up with gulags and in the as the primary sign of the workers' paradise.
Well, this is why I always get a little bit nervous when I start talking about isms, and to a certain extent even distributism, because any ideal that is superimposed onto the organic reality is going to require some degree of forcing people who aren't interested in it into compliance. Now, it could be either a good or a bad, but with the libertarians and the Austrians and so forth, I kind of see their point about coercion. I don't see their point when they take it so far as to say that they can watch their fellow human beings starve to death and not be compelled to be subject to a tax to better the life of such persons. But there is a certain level at which I think people ought to be able to find their own way and seek their own creativity and speak their own minds and worship it in their own way, and that's where. And I think it's a matter of degree. When we think in the abstract, we're always looking at bright lines, but these bright lines never seem to be drawn in the right place, best as I can see.
Exactly. I think whenever you try to impose any system, from the top down. You get that illegitimate coercion. I don't believe in revolution. I believe in evolution. These things have to grow organically, okay? Seeds have to be planted. So I'm not looking to take over the government with the distributist party and establish, the dictatorship of the distributists, because that would be just as bad as the dictatorship of the proletariat. What I am looking to do is to maybe find a polity that is more favorable to the small enterprise rather than the giant enterprise, rather that allows rooms for such things as cooperatives, that encourages cooperatives rather than encouraging, as we have done since at least the middle of the last century, encouraging the giant corporation as the primary engine of production.
But John, I'd like to see you as the symbol of a personality cult, though, with that fedora there. I think it'd be great.
Yeah, well,
I want to. Actually, you just gave me an idea. I think I want this to take flight.
I'm growing the beard that I think is required for a personality cult leader, but the plain fact of the matter is I'm probably getting too old for it. I probably missed my opportunity to be a cult leader a long time ago. So
don't cut yourself short. You got it's age and wisdom and everything else. We could tell people you're alive long after you're gone, man.
Yes,
200 years old. We just need you as a symbol, all right? And then write your instructions down so we can.
I like your creativity. I think it's but I probably would make a better when it comes to that. I'd probably make a better cult leader. Well, put this delicately, probably better dead than alive.
Yeah, just don't make the mistake that you're more valuable to your family dead than alive. That's.
I hide the insurance policy.
That's interesting. But when you say you don't want to distribute this party, and actually. There's a reason why I don't want to distribute this party, which has nothing to do with distributism, but the fact that third parties can't really make any headway in a society with where you have single member districts and the plurality winner wins. In other words, if you've heard of Duverger, Michael Duverger, I think he was. I only read it. I don't know how to actually pronounce it, but it's Duverger. And there's something called Duverger's Law. And in a society with an electoral system like ours, it just tends to a two-party system. And I don't see, and I'm convinced of it. We won't spend a lot of time on it now, but I don't see how we can get past it. But but I have no problem with a distributist faction within one of the major parties. I think that's something that, I don't see any reason why we can't have distributist policies, like you just mentioned one, having say maybe tax incentives for cooperatives or for companies that have real ESOPs. Not when I mean by real ESOPs, I mean real stock ownership for employees rather than just, a retirement plan, where they actually have voting shares and vote on everything.
I think there's a good reason for having differential taxation, for example, to encourage small business, to encourage collectives, to cooperatives, to encourage cooperative marketing organizations for farmers, for example. I think those things should be governed differently, should be recognized in law as different kinds of entities. I think they have a social utility in and of themselves that should displace some of their legitimate tax liabilities. They should be governed different. They should be regulated differently and taxed differently. So those are the kinds of things that help to build up a distributist society, that help it to evolve as I think capitalism is collapsing. Then we need to take the remains of capitalism as sort of the manure for a more distributist society.
Well, let me run this idea by you, and I've always wanted to run this by you, and it's hard. usually communicate with you on social media, and it doesn't really work quite as well as this. And that is, if you go back to Rerum Novarum, and I think we've neglected to mention, if we haven't, that much of the impetus for distributism came from Leo XIII's Magna Carta of Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum. Am I right?
That's regarded as the as pretty much the founding document, although I have a somewhat different theory about that.
Oh, okay. Let's hear it.
Okay. Rerum Novarum was more or less kind of forced on Leo. I mean, the bishops were not pleased with his first social encyclical, which was the social encyclical against socialism, which basically, I think it was Quod Apostolici Moneris, was written 6 months after his election, I believe. You have to make allowances for Leo because in 25 years he had 85 encyclicals. Mm-hmm. But it advised, the poor to be obedient in this world and they would get rewarded in the next world. Well, the bishops who actually had to deal with, the working class mm-hmm. were not awfully enthusiastic about that. And I think Rerum Novarum opened the gates to discussion, but the funny thing is it sort of bifurcated because he started not with property, but with the living wage, the just wage. So mm-hmm. it became a distribution of wages rather than a distribution of property. Remember, Leo's plan was to distribute property by raising wages. And the distributists kind of slyly, Chesterton and Belloc, stood Rerum Novarum on its head. They started with the distribution of property as the key to the just wage. Mm-hmm. So, and they just sort of, ignored or kind of selectively read Rerum Novarum. The one who read it correctly was John Ryan, who, was big in the New Deal, because the New Deal was about raising wages, not about distributing property. As a matter of fact, the New Dealers wanted to gather property in big corporations because they thought that was more efficient, especially for war production. So anyway, Rerum Novarum really comes alive as it's read by Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno. And I think, in a way, Quadragesimo Anno is a better foundation for Catholic social teaching than Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum allows us to discuss the subject because it hadn't been discussed 100 years prior. Okay? So Rerum Novarum opens up the flood, but I really prefer the reading given to it by Pius XI.
Well, I mean, the Spirit moves as it will, but we have, and the Holy Spirit may speak in ways completely beyond the intention of the speakers. I think the magisterium works like that quite a bit. Point of fact, but I'm not a theologian, but that's what I think. But what I find in Rerum Novarum is a very interesting part, and I don't have it here in front of me, but when he talks about property, he almost seems to adopt John Locke's theory of property without all of the metaphysics of something you put yourself into the thing that you're creating. But it's almost a Lockean theory of property.
Absolutely, it's absolutely Lockean. As a matter of fact, it's kind of odd because here's Leo XIII, the great Thomist, all right? Mm-hmm. And he quotes Thomas extensively in Rerum Novarum, but not on property. His view of property is not scholastic. It's not Thomistic. His view of property is Lockean. It's the first occupation theory, which is nonsense. There's no property on the planet that traces back to first occupation.
Let me give you a little. Go ahead, say that. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted you. Please continue. Well, anyway, what I was going to say was, But let me just push back on that just a little bit, because let's put ourselves back in the time before there were states. Okay, and when before there were all these theories about where property comes from.
Yeah.
Well, in the first instance, when somebody picks an apple from a tree, and I guess I'm betraying my reading of Locke, but there's only two ways to get property in that circumstance without some overriding judicial system, and that is either by labor or by conquest. Okay, before there's a monetary system.
Let me interrupt you there. Every piece of property on the planet traces back to right of conquest. I am standing on this piece of property because the Americans joined with the Texans, and the Texans took it from the Mexicans, and the Mexicans took it from the Spanish, and the Spanish took it from the Apache, and the Apache took it from the Mandan or whoever. Okay, and that's true of every piece of property. So, in a quite historical sense, Marx is right. All property is theft, or at least all property is conquest. When you do get down to villages, anthropologists, who can find villages in the jungles of Brazil, at the village level, property is always allocated by the community. It's owned by the community and allocated to families. And this is fairly universal. It's the biblical system, in fact. That's why in the original property codes, you could not sell property. Okay, you could not sell property. You could lease it for 7 years, but then it had to revert to its original owner. And so property was allocated by the tribe to the family for their use. When they stopped using it, it was no longer their property. It was the tribe's property.
Well, let's not illegitimately import contemporary individualism into this, but let us, at the same time, go back and let's put ourselves in a time machine, and they can't see us, but we're going to adjudicate between people. Now here's a guy that came and he found a field and he labored over it and he grew beans. Okay. And now, I know believe in natural law, so there is a natural law, and it comes from reason, all that, right? So we're just going to assume that. And here comes a guy and he's going to start throwing spears and at him and trying to club him so that he can take over his field that he worked so hard to grow these beans on. He's going to try and take this guy's beans. Okay, now you've just come back as a time machine, and now you're going to adjudicate between those two people. Who has the right to the beans? The guy that worked for him, or the guy that just knocked him over the head?
Okay. Could I start by questioning the case? Okay. What I was saying is this mythical individual doesn't exist. What exists is the family.
Right. I'm using it as a simplification. So in other words, I might.
I understand.
Okay. Yeah.
You simplify to a case that really I think cannot exist. Aristotle held that paradoxically held that the state was prior to the family. Now that's kind of bizarre. I think it's wrong.
That's heresy anyway. but let's say it's a family that did it.
That doesn't mean anything here. Certainly wouldn't have meant anything to Aristotle. But why? The interesting part is, why does he think that? Well, the state isn't prior to the family, but the tribe is. Held the state was prior to the individual. The family is prior to the individual. I know you always get the chicken and eggs problem, but nevertheless, the family is prior to the individual. So, if you have a case where you do have a case, and you obviously would sometime have a case where somebody goes out into a field that isn't owned or not tribal property, leaves the tribe, he's technically therefore a barbarian, he finds a field, he plants beans. Well, it's hard to say that that's not his property. However, the problem we actually face is land is generally occupied first by a community, not by individuals. And that community allocates the property. And that's pretty much, I think, every anthropologist would say that. I don't think that there's much dispute about that in anthropology. Private property is always a much, much later growth. After the state becomes powerful. I mean, Proudhon is pretty right. It's the state that creates private property. It's not the village, and it's not the individual. It's the state that allocates private property, and you cannot have private property without a state to allocate it, to protect it, to register the deed, to send out the cops to collect the rent, that sort of thing.
Well, I can't get any anthropologists to talk to me for some reason. They always hang up on me. But let's just change that cultivated these lands, and another tribe comes, and a tribe is really an extended kind of family, I think. Yeah. And the other tribe comes along and wants to take it. Now can we, with spears and arrows and rocks?
Yeah.
And now can we adjudicate between them?
No.
Why not?
You do that.
Why can't we adjudicate? Isn't there any natural law that applies to that situation before there are the instruments of law?
One tribe ought not to steal another tribe's land. However, if you try to enforce that, we're all going to have to quit America and go back to Europe.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is, I'm not trying to say that we can try and repair that now. That would I don't know where I would be sacrificed under some druid tree, I think. But what I'm talking about is the nature of that property, the nature of that right, being a part of natural law never changes. And so the fact that we operate on a different basis has created an imbalance whereby every single human system that has ever been developed, which, as you say, has come about by conquest, results in an imbalance so that you have a kind of class system where one group is oppressed. That's what I'm driving at. I'm not trying to say go back and replace all the divots, because that would be not only practically impossible, but historically impossible, because we don't know. At a certain point, we lose track of who was the original occupier of land. But what I'm driving at is that we can take that principle and recognize in that principle the seeds of imbalance in every human economic system that has existed hitherto, and in recognizing that, move to repair it as best as we can. And that distributism actually answers that by means of its distribution of property. That is where I was going with it.
Okay. Well, I mean, you kind of touched on a whole wide range of issues there. But let me start with the natural law. Mm-hmm. The natural law on property, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, who's fairly authoritative, is that there is no private property. Private property is not part of the natural law. The natural law indicates common property. Private property, Thomas says, is introduced by man legitimately for practical purposes. It just works better, according to Thomas, than common property. So private property is a human addition to the natural law, but it holds only so long as it works, okay? So in cases of need, Thomas says, in cases of extreme need, property reverts to its common state. So that, or as Thomas puts it, necessity makes all things common. So, for example, if you're in the midst of a flood, all right, you can legitimately break into a grocery store and take the things you need to survive. So you can take bread and water and whatever you need to survive during that flood, because now it has become common property. But the natural law dictates common property, which is then by man divided into private property for practical purposes. But it never overrides the natural law.
All right. Well, what I guess I'm asking you, though, at this point is if there is no private property in natural law, then what have the Popes been talking about when they say don't have socialism, when by socialism they mean abolition of private property and the means of production? Socialism, if it works, if private property no longer works, why can't we have that kind of socialism where nobody owns the means of production and it's all commonly owned, obviously through the instrumentation of the state?
Yeah. Well, I think some have introduced a third term, an intermediary term, which is personal property. So, and that would be closer to the view of Proudhon. So again, that personal property is property you take out of common usage. And by the way, you'll find this in St. Basil the Great. You'll find it in St. Augustine. You'll find it in John Chrysostom. You'll find it in lots of the early fathers. So a person is sort of entitled to take from the common pool that property he needs to support his own family. Okay, that's personal property rather than private property. And the difference is that it's the amount of property he can use, that a family can use. Okay, it can't be more than that. More than that is common property. And if he appropriates more than what he can use, he's stolen. So this sort of personal property intervenes as this third term between private property and collective property.
Sounds like he took that from John Locke himself, who basically said that at least in terms of the primitive state, until that was the state of things until money came along. You couldn't, if things rotted in your hands, you would basically take it more than you were supposed to take. And that seems to be in the second treatise. In that part, what Locke is saying in the first part of that letter, Locke is just repeating what would have been the common understanding of property at the time. Mm-hmm. The second half of that letter is going to reverse that understanding. Okay, using money as the excuse, using not money but gold. Locke doesn't say money. Locke says gold, and the reason he says gold is because gold is permanent. At least in Locke's reasoning, gold is permanent. So, if you're just growing vegetables, it doesn't make any sense to grow more vegetables than you can eat. And they just rot. Mm-hmm. But if you're exchanging the vegetables for gold, now it makes a lot of sense to grow a lot more vegetables than you can eat, to acquire a lot more land than you can use, to get slaves, to get horses, to get machinery, and grow rich forever and ever, per omnia segula segulorum. So Locke is starting out with a common view of property, but he's going to overturn that view of property. Yeah, that's it. Okay. It's been a while since I read it, but I thank you for your explanation, because that does make it clear. So I guess what you're saying is that what's the church, when it's been saying that there is a right of private property, what are we saying here? That that's incorrect, or that there's a misunderstanding? I mean, I noticed when you said personal property, my lawyer brain went, okay, that's property that you can move around, versus real property, which is stuck to the ground, right? But so maybe there's a terminology difference that I'm not quite getting here, because I read the encyclicals, and private property remains a right in the encyclicals, and but if there is no actual right, now there's the caveat that the state has the right to direct the use of that property, but there's still a right of private property. Well, it has the right to use in quadragesimo anno, it does, in rerum novarum it does not. Leo will say that the ownership of property is a matter of law, the use of property is a matter of charity, which the law cannot address. So, but that's what Pius reverses in quadragesimo anno. Pius will say that the law
yes, indeed, can control the use of property. So because the use of property falls under justice as well as charity. So therefore, as a matter of justice, it can indeed be regulated by the state.
Well, contrary to popular opinion, though, Leo the 13th really did say that the state can intervene in the relationship between capitalists and workers, and he did say, as a matter of justice, that a worker must be paid in a sufficient amount to support himself and his family. And so that is a directive that would come from the state. I can conceive of no other way of looking at that. Address that if you could.
No, he's explicit that it is the state that has the right to intervene in the matter of the wage. And he's not terribly consistent, because if it can intervene, well, the wage is still a property, presumably of the capitalist. So if he could intervene in the matter of the wage, it's not entirely consistent to say that property then, the use of property is a matter of charity and not of justice. So it's, like I said, it's why I said at the beginning that Rerum Novarum is a starting place, but it really needs to be read through Quadragesimo Anno, in my opinion.
I see. And, well, even the subsequent social encyclicals, all the way down to through Centesimus Annus on, I would think.
Yes, they all make some modification to Rerum Novarum.
Well, and I think that necessarily so, because the material circumstances were different. The world confronted by Leo the 13th when he wrote Rerum Novarum was in many respects a different one than the one we face today. I mean, we still see some pretty outrageous behavior on the part of capitalists, but in the United States we don't see much in the way of child labor in factories. Although a writer for the Accident Institute was, I think, promoting that not too long ago.
They always have, yeah. That's not true with them, no.
So, as circumstances change, the ways in which the issues are going to be addressed are going to change to meet those circumstances, I would think. I mean, that's it may give the appearance of change in the teaching, but it's really application of the same principle to different social circumstances. And that principle is, even before the industrial age, that every human being is an end in himself or herself.
Yes.
That would basically, it's the golden rule: treat other people like you would want to be treated yourself. Anybody can take from that what everything that comes down to us in Catholic social teaching, I think, without a whole lot of scholarly discussion about it. Because when I've never read anything in the social encyclicals that tell me anything other than that people ought to be treated as ends in themselves, as another self.
Yes, indeed.
As a human being. Well, okay, so distributism, it wants to spread that property. And so, and we've already touched on this already, but what are some of the means that you would see that spread of property can take place? And I assuming that it's not too late for distributism to get a hold in American society. Maybe we're just crumbling. But if somehow we got some enlightened legislators in place, how would we make that happen?
Well, we could start by enforcing existing law, specifically the antitrust laws, and break up big enterprises. Unfortunately, antitrust law changed seriously by the courts and by especially a ruling from Justice Robert Bork. So Bork put in a consumer standard. Well, instead of saying that a cartel or a monopoly was bad in itself, it was only bad if it resulted in higher prices. You see, if it would resulted in lower prices, then it was a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first place, that's nonsense. Lower prices aren't necessarily better prices. You can get lower prices just by employing slave labor, or what we're doing today, use contract labor or gigs, the gig economy, or on-call labor. There's lots of ways to lower prices that are socially destructive. So it is the monopoly, the cartel in itself, that is wrong and shouldn't be allowed and should be broken up as much as possible. So that's one place you can start, all right, to reestablish distributism. Actually, we had distributism, but we lost it in the second half of the 19th century as in the age of the robber barons. That is, we were a country of small producers, small farmers. We were distributists, which is the natural economic system of the world. So we can enforce the antitrust laws. That's number one. But I think there's also practical things you can do. You can give cooperatives more recognition in law. Okay, right now the only tool for cooperatives is pretty much the ESOP. And the ESOP can be good or can be bad. I mean, after all, Enron was an ESOP, but not really. On the other hand, Springfield Remanufacturing is an ESOP, and it's fantastic. It's great. It works, like distributism is supposed to work. So we can have other legal means for cooperatives other than the ESOP. ESOP's a good tool in certain circumstances, not in all circumstances. We can have differential taxation and differential regulation for the small business and the large business. Think about this. Archer's Daniels Midland, so it runs a pig barn with 40,000 pigs, and something happens and salmonella, whatever, gets into the food chain. Okay, slaughtering 40,000 pigs a week or whatever it is, these are spread all over the country before they find it. They finally find it, and they put in some new regulation that costs a fortune but prevents the problem. Well, this same regulation is put on the small pig farmer who might, slaughter 400 pigs a week and sell them locally. All right, but you can't amortize that same cost over 400 pigs like you can over 40,000 pigs. You see, so. Actually, when ADM screws up, they actually improve their position because they can absorb regulatory costs, but the same regulations go on the small farmer, and he cannot absorb those regulatory costs. So there has to be differential regulation for large firms and small firms. There has to be differential labor laws. There has to be differential tax laws, in my opinion. But also, the government can stop subsidizing and favoring the big firm. Let me tell you one thing that can be done right today, which would destroy Walmart and increase justice. One of the biggest subsidies that business receives is called the freeway. It's an absurd name for a highway system. Freeways are not actually free. I mean, the people who build them, they charge money for their labor and for their cement. They're not free. They don't come from heaven. But the major expense in building a highway is weight and repetition. Right? So it is a completely different matter to build things for 8,000-pound cars and trucks and 80,000-pound behemoths. So, and most of the money is in the last pound of weight that has to be carried. It's asymptotic. The costs rise asymptotically for the higher weight levels. So,
I told you not to swear on this program, John.
So if instead of a freeway system, you had weight and distance tolls, the subsidy the trucking gets, and hence Walmart gets, because it doesn't pay its full distribution costs, would favor the local producer over the long distance producer. So instead of making low-valued goods like socks in the interior of China, shipping them to Shanghai, putting them on a boat, shipping them to Long Beach, putting them on a truck, shipping them to where are they in Missouri? Bentonville, Arkansas, and then offloading them, putting them on another truck, and shipping them out to their distribution centers, etc., etc. Okay, that supply chain is subsidized at each step, whether it's the shipping, the ports, the highways, the railroads, it's all subsidized. And if you removed the subsidies, then Walmart paying its full shipping cost, the whole model would collapse. And the local provider would be privileged over the long distance provider.
Well, now that is a very interesting point. These are the intricacies that often are not thought about when it comes to how we can improve the economy. In my simple way, I always think in terms of, when I think of distributism, I think of how we are going to make employees owners, and whether we're going to break up companies or not. And I think that there's a lot of reason to actually enforce the antitrust laws that they used to be on the books, but nowadays every merger seems to get approved unless Donald Trump has managed it for some reason.
Right.
Yeah. And let me parenthetically point this out. A lot of times when I speak with distributors, I get the sense that they want us to go back to where you could go to the blacksmith shop and get everything done, and in other words, they want to uninvent a lot of technology. It seems to me.
Yes.
Okay, I don't think we can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but I do see a way in which distributors' principles can be applied to the economy that we have. And I don't even really want to use the term ESOP because that's really a retirement plan. I want a plan that goes to that goes to compensating the labor value of each employee in the form of ownership shares.
Yes.
And what that will do is give them actual voting ownership shares, gets the same dividend as every other stockholder, and eventually gives them seats on the board and everything else, so that there's a transference from a merely capital ownership. And I'm not saying abolish capital ownership, but transference from a totally capital ownership to also a labor ownership, which actually becomes another kind of capital ownership. In other words, it's not just money. Let me just put it this way, and you're the guest, and I should let you talk more, but it's exciting to talk to you, so I got one of these ideas by you. If it's always struck me as a kind of absurdity or even a contradiction that money, which, unless it is gained through such things as interest or rent, is actually an abstraction of labor. Okay, I go out and I perform some service or some good, and get money for it. Okay, so that's my labor abstracted into money. Now I can take that money and I can buy shares of stock with it, but for some reason I can't just apply my labor directly to the company and get shares of stock. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so that strikes me as a kind of absurdity. So if labor could actually result in purchase of stock, I think we might begin to see a resolution of the contradictions that exist in our society, and we would see the fulfillment of G.K. Chesterton's maxim that the problem with capitalism is that there are too few capitalists.
Exactly. Yes. Well, labor has to come into ownership of the firm, I think, for distributism to be realized as John Paul II said in Laborum Exertions, we can only talk about the proper socialization of property when the laborer is entitled to consider himself the owner or the part owner of the workbench at which he is working with everybody else. Now, you see that exactly in structures like the Mondragon Workers Cooperative in Spain, which I think is the third largest corporation in Spain. You see it in Springfield Remanufacturing Company. You see it in a number of, and actually thousands of other places. You see it in Semco in Brazil. So, I mean, there are many, many, many examples of that working, and working very, very successfully. Because when people, I'm not so much care about the capital stock, but I do care about their ownership of the company and their ownership of the direction of the company. Okay, when employees own the company, okay, it turns out they're always the best managers because they're the ones who do the work. And they're the ones who are, they don't drain the company. They manage it responsibly because they now, by ownership, they also have responsibility for its continued existence, because its continued existence is their continued existence. Germany kind of simulates this in a way by having representatives of the union sit on the board of directors of all the major companies. So they have a different kind of labor setup than we do. Until recently, they had no minimum wage because they didn't need it, because wages were set kind of sector by sector between the union and the companies, and sort of a...
well, that's the kind of corporatism that Pius XI talked about.
Yes, very much so. And Germany was very much influenced. As a matter of fact, all of Western Europe after World War II was very much influenced by Quadragesimo Anno, as was the New Deal of Roosevelt. It's. But there are a lot of different. I mean, there are myriad ways to get to that same thing. At least some sort of worker representation, some sort of worker ownership. In varying degrees, depending upon the state of the society and their history, and et cetera, et cetera. Again, we want evolution, not revolution. These things have to grow organically and naturally over time.
Right. And that's, and I think that is, as far as I can tell, that's really the future of distributism. It's not going back to the halcyon days when everybody had so many acres and a cow or whatever that phrase was, but
it is that as well. I mean, because right now the factory farm does more damage to the land, as Wendell Berry pointed out. Our next problem might not be peak oil; it might be peak soil, because farming has become extractive.
But it's the ownership of the workers that promises to reverse that. You follow me? In other words, if they,
farm, I think that ownership of the land is farms of a more reasonable size, but
Okay, well, it turns out that there's just not enough time to talk about all this because we're getting towards the end of the hour, and it's really been great to have you here. What's the name of that book again? Toward a Truly Free Market, and it's got a subtitle. Distributive perspective on the role of government, taxes, healthcare, deficits, and more. Where can they get that? That's available on Amazon, isn't it?
It's available on Amazon. Yes.
Yeah. Whoever is listening to this, if you haven't read that, you really need to. It is essential if you want to understand distributism. If you want to be a distributist who is literate in economic language, so that when you're talking with other people about these things, it's really important that you read this, because it's really a shorthand manual to getting yourself up to snuff on economic terms. I've really enjoyed it. There's a lot more that I wanted to talk about tonight with Mr. Medaille, but it's been exciting having you on. What are your plans in the future? Going to keep writing for Front Porch Republic, I suppose, and what else?
I just keep writing and keep teaching, and until as long as I'm until I get any more senile than I already am. I'll just keep writing and teaching and trying to proselytize on social media, and that's that and gardening. That's gardening and grandchildren. That's pretty much it.
And you're going to be on the Open Door this Friday at I get on at 10 o'clock, which is Central Time, so it must be 11 o'clock Eastern. But we'll look forward to talking to you then, and good night, everyone.
Jack, thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.